What is Dungeons and Dragons? You've seen it in shows like The Community and Stranger Things. There's been celebrities that have been talking about it and play it, such as Vin Diesel, Joe Manganiello, and many more. But you might be sitting there asking, what is Dungeons and Dragons? Hopefully by the end of this video, you have a much more clear picture of what Dungeons and Dragons is and a little bit of how it's played. Though this is not a full tutorial on how to play Dungeons and Dragons, this video would be super long if it was. So, if you look up the definition of Dungeons and Dragons, you'll get some definition like it's a fantasy tabletop role-playing game, which is true, or it's a collaborative storytelling game, which is also true, but it may not give you a great idea of what it is. A collaborative storytelling game basically means that everyone is telling a story together, which is cool because there's no win condition. The way you win at Dungeons and Dragons is just having fun. And in essence, Dungeons and Dragons is really the structure and rule system you put in place while telling a story with all of your friends. Still probably not a clear picture on what it is. So first, let me kind of go a little bit into why you might want to play Dungeons and Dragons. If you have ever watched a show like Game of Thrones and thought, I wish that would have ended differently, or you've read a book and you loved the world and wished you could interact with it more, or played a video game and wanted more choices, or you wanted your choices to have consequences, then D&D might be exactly what you're looking for. It was definitely what I was looking for when I got into playing it. And the reason being is when playing Dungeons and Dragons, you are only limited by your collaborative imaginations and dice rolls. Every table has that one guy that has great ideas that should work, but just rolls terribly. But we'll get more into dice rolls in a little bit. So how is Dungeons and Dragons played? The overarching flow of it is there's basically three pillars of Dungeons and Dragons, which is exploration, combat, and social encounters. They're all a little bit different, but flow in a similar manner. A D&D game flow will generally go as follows. Dungeon Master will explain a situation. The players will then say what they would like to do. Then they roll dice to determine the outcome. Now, I just said a couple things that might not make any sense to you if you've never played. Dungeon Masters, players. Aren't everyone players? Well, let's get into that a little bit. When playing Dungeons & Dragons, there are two roles that people fall under. There is the Dungeon Master, who is the person who creates the game, runs the game, and is basically like the referee. We'll talk about them a little bit more in a second. The other group are the players. There are generally 3 to 6 players, but that can vary greatly depending on the table because you can have as few as 1 player, and I don't even know the most players that have ever played on a table, but it's probably a ridiculous amount. I usually play with around 4 to 5 players. Now, as a player, you will create your character. Your character is your fantasy character. It can be like you or completely different than you. It doesn't really matter, but that will be your person in the world. When creating a character, you typically start by picking a race, which is kind of like your species, and this also can vary a lot depending on the setting that you're in, which, side note, one of the things that makes Dungeons & Dragons really hard to explain to people is it varies so much depending on the table that is playing it. But back into creating a character, you have your race. They can be anything from like a human, an elf, a dwarf, and depending on the world that you're in, it could be like an android or similar things. Then after selecting your race, you will select your class or your job, and this determines more of what your role in the party will be. It could be anything from like a sneaky thief to a tough fighter to a very intelligent, crafty, cunning wizard. The choice is yours, and there are a lot more options than that depending on the table that you are playing on and the edition that you are using. I say this because there are many different editions to Dungeons & Dragons, 5th edition being the most popular at the moment, and there are technically things like Pathfinder that aren't Dungeons & Dragons, but they're very similar and they kind of fall under that same umbrella. So then after you have your race and your class decided, you can generate some stats, create an awesome backstory, and jump into the world. The world you are jumping into is generally created by the Dungeon Master. The Dungeon Master is the one who also works as a referee enforcing rules, and they are the primary storyteller. As I said, the Dungeon Master will typically describe a situation, then ask the players what they want to do. The players will then roll dice to determine the outcome. But where different characters come in handy is they have different skills, and you get to add those skills to that role. So a thief might be better at sneaking, or a rogue if you're playing 5th edition. whereas a tough fighter or barbarian might be stronger and better at lifting heavy objects, and so they don't need to roll as high on your d20. D20 means a 20-sided die. It looks a lot like this. Now, from here, I could go into a lot more detail, but that's pretty much Dungeons and Dragons. Each player and party will focus on different pillars or aspects of the game. Some really enjoy role-playing and using different accents and flexing those acting and improv skills, whereas other tables might enjoy the combat and using tactics and the way that they move their character around. Whereas there might be other tables that enjoy exploration and puzzles and discovering ancient cities and ruins. It all depends on the table. But what I can tell you is that if you enjoy using your imagination and telling stories with friends, you will probably really enjoy Dungeons & Dragons. You just have to find the right group for you. If you want more details and specifics on how Dungeons & Dragons is played, I have plenty of other videos on this channel for you to go check out, and I hope I see you around.